The game of whac-a-mole is very real. It's not going to go anywhere because we're choosing to do battle with an incredibly strong market and motivation. And we're choosing to do battle with pure creation, which is what chemistry really is. And that's a foolish battle we're going to lose. People have this like very deep, visceral reaction to having to think about science because we do a shit job of teaching it. And the fact that that's where drugs live, I think it makes it so easy for people to get really entrenched in like this bizarre urban legend that should in no way continue, but it does.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
Nowadays, it seems like reality is on the chopping block. Truth is more and more seen as merely a tool for power instead of a statement about the nature of nature. Facts, evidence, and reason routinely take a back seat to whatever emotionally charged rhetoric our society is prone to pursuing, what is politically expedient, or just what will take out the other side in an argument. Does anyone care whether what the leaders of our country say is actually true anymore? Should folks even apologize anymore when we misspeak, make a factual error, or even outright lie? It seems like more and more the way to win is just unapologetic narcissism. This dynamic is nowhere more profound than when it comes to drugs and the people who use them. As we enter into an age of authoritarianism, those on the margins of society are the most impacted by the deep disdain for truth that many in our cultures seem to carry whenever it disconfirms existing beliefs. But there are still voices of refuge in the morass of lies and misinformation that we all face when it comes to people who use drugs. People who remain experts in the face of an unprecedented rejection of expertise. I'm Aaron Ferguson, and you're listening to Narcotica. It's our goal to use this show to bring you those voices just as much as we can. As long as podcasting remains a platform for the masses and a last vestige of free thought, Narcotica plans to keep on chugging along. Today's episode is an interview with just one of those experts. A person whose writing and work stands tall in the face of anti-intellectualism in the world of drug use. We're honored to bring you Claire Zagorski today, and hope that you really do enjoy our discussion. This show is a listener-supported endeavor, and we're deeply grateful to our listeners who have taken the initiative to help keep this train rolling on the tracks. If these topics are of interest to you, and if you support access to the types of clear information we strive to deliver, please consider subscribing, giving us a like or review, or even donating via our Patreon, info in the show notes. We plan to bring you many more discussions like the one today and hope that you all remain well and resilient. And now we bring you Claire Zagorski. Hello, Narcotica listeners. Thank you for joining us today. This is your co-producer, Aaron Ferguson, and we are greeting you here today with a new guest on the show that we're really excited about. And I'm joined by Troy Farah, who you're really used to hearing most of the time in this introduction. Say hi, Troy.
Hey, how's it going?
Well, today we're really excited to have a good friend of mine and someone we've been wanting to have on the show for quite some time. Claire, say hi.
Hi, everyone.
Claire and I met on a needle exchange van about 7 years ago or something like that. And ever since then, I've been partners in crime down in Texas. And Claire does work all over the country. Claire is a licensed paramedic and a graduate research assistant and PhD student in translational science at the University of Texas at Austin. She studies illicit drug supply contamination and composition and drug checking implementation. And we're just really excited to have Claire on. We've had discussions about doing this for a while. But to start with, Claire, can you tell us a little bit about how you wound up getting involved with all this type of work?
Yeah. Also excited to be here. Thanks to y'all for inviting me on. And hello to everyone. I am a so like yeah, like Aaron mentioned, I'm a paramedic, and it's not something that I do. I don't practice. I'm not in the field anymore because I'm a student. But that is where I got exposed to harm reduction and drug user activism when I first started thinking about it. Um, like many Americans, most Americans probably, I was raised in like the stew of just say no, of, the drug war being kind of an absolute correct thing. I went through DARE when I was in early middle school. I think fifth grade is when I went through DARE. So, I had the default setting that we all do. And as I went through life, I finished college, went to EMT school and paramedic school. I started working in an ER. And one thing is that I kept seeing the same patients over and over again for overdose and then non-overdose issues like related to drug use, like infection. Constantly the same people, like shift after shift. And we would basically stabilize them, make sure that they're breathing for 45 minutes, and then they would go. And there's plenty of really inefficient things that happen in the ER, but that was one that really stuck with me. And then one day, I'm, waiting for an ambulance to bring in a patient for an overdose. They'd called ahead and let us know that was happening. And they come down the hall with this patient, and the firefighter says, don't stress out about this one. His friends already gave him naloxone at the scene. And so by the time we arrived, he was awake and he was fine. And I just kind of stopped in my tracks and I asked, I was like, how did his friends get naloxone? And the guy was like, I don't know. And yeah, he was not incorrect. This patient was in great shape. He hadn't, gone through any kind of extended period of time without breathing. Like they were able to give him naloxone pretty much right away, like on scene, which is exactly what we described to people. And I had never heard of the idea of naloxone distribution before. And I was like, that is fucking brilliant. I kept thinking about it throughout the shift. And I was like, I do not know why everyone isn't doing this. I was like, this is the smartest thing. This made a huge difference for this patient. It takes one slip up, it takes one kink in the chain for it to not be caught and for them to just stop breathing and never wake up. So I was like, that's brilliant. And so I started reading more about it, and eventually read, I wish this was a cooler story. I eventually read a piece on BuzzFeed about harm reduction. And like I went back and I looked at it the other day, and it is really, I mean, it's very simple. It's harm reduction 101 for babies. And I was like, all of this makes perfect sense. Um, and yeah, I just was completely enamored of what an incredibly good idea it was, while at the same time being really struck by how much antipathy there was towards it. I was like, it's strange. It is very, there's something off. The fact that it has this much benefit and this much evidence, and people are so against it. I was like, what's going on here? And so I found out about THRA, started volunteering, or not THRA, at that time it was AHRC, Austin Harm Reduction Coalition, which is now defunct. But they welcomed me, even though I didn't really know anything. Mark Kinsley was my like big mentor on the van, which is also where I met Aaron. And, he was really clear from the get-go. He was like, as long as you're humble and you're willing to listen and learn and be nice, you're always welcome here and you're welcome to learn. And learned a great deal and kept going. And then the more I kept going, the more I had I had questions, couldn't find answers. And then I kind of found a fit for my love of researching things. And so now I'm interested in, building up a really good understanding of what does and doesn't work in harm reduction, what it's about, and how we can provide solutions and then also replicate them. So, it's not isolated pockets of people having to reinvent the wheel every time. So that's kind of my mission with the research that I do.
Yeah, I remember the first time we met, you were in your uniform on the back of the van. And I had never seen somebody in a paramedic uniform on a syringe exchange van at that point. And so I was like, oh, wow, that's pretty cool. And I think there was a couple of you guys that would come out. the uniform itself, I think, has come a long way, frankly. I mean, like there have been years where like if I saw somebody on a uniform at a needle exchange, I would think they were a cop. Like the first syringe exchange programs I went to in Santa Cruz as a kid, I'd have to hide all my dope walking up to the joint, and then I'd often see them get taken away in handcuffs. And this is back when I came to find out Santa Cruz was involved in a huge battle that had a national impact for access to syringes. I didn't know any of this. I was just living on the roof of a drop-in center there. So like first time I saw it, I was like, wow, okay. But even since then, times have changed. And since then, oh my God, your research capacity and your capacity for learning must be next level, because I learned something new every time I hear you present. So Claire just knows a lot about the drug supply and just different, the properties of different substances. And folks probably have read something she's written in Filter as well, or somewhere else. I think there's a lot of room for discussion, a lot of different directions we could go today. We've been doing work locally, Claire and I, around some drug checking in Texas. And we mentioned some of this on the last episode and then on the episode that we did with Dr. Dasgupta. So Texas is a very unique environment for that. We were the first ones to locate xylazine down here. And it had been reported in the news, funnily enough, that they had found it. Apparently, I don't know where they found it, and there was never any toxicology results produced. But there's a group of drug users down here doing drug checking, and Claire's been helping out with that, kind of on the logistical side. You want to talk a little bit about the study that we did?
Yeah. And I feel like that folds in nicely to kind of like what makes Texas frustrating. Because it's actually a really simple idea and it's something that's happening all over the country. But here, for legal reasons, it's kind of awful. Which isn't to say that's not worth doing. But yeah, so this all pins back to Nab Dasgupta. Again, he's our co-conspirator in this, and he and his team at UNC are the ones that actually do our drug checking. Kind of went, and this is also something that was really impressed upon me in the ER, and I had some really, patients I think about every day, like to this day, where I was like, the problem here was that we didn't know what this person took. They didn't know what they took, and that ended up making things terrifying for everyone. So plenty of things happened to really impress upon me that the lack of understanding on like a day-to-day consumer by consumer basis of what is in the drug supply is itself a really big problem. And the like I have something of a background in chemistry. I'm not a very good chemist, but I do try really hard to kind of I use what I know to shine some light on what's going on with drugs and drug use and drug manufacturing. But all of that is to say that the way that like the gold standard nationally and internationally for understanding what's in a drug, get a sample, is to use GCMS testing, which is gas chromatography mass spectrometry, just two different techniques combined to produce a result. And I won't get too much into that. I don't think it's hugely interesting, but it's it's what you're familiar with if you watch like NCIS and they're looking for the composition of mud they scrape out of someone's tire or something. It tells you exactly what's in there. You don't have to use like reagent strips or like droppers or anything like that. And there's nothing wrong with those. It's just very definitive, but it's expensive and you have to have the lab set up and especially with GCMS, it's got to pretty much be in a physical space somewhere because it doesn't like to be vibrated. It doesn't do well on like a van or a truck or something. And for the most part, so far anyway, you need like at least a master's level chemist to run and interpret it. All of which is to say, I was like, this is very valuable. The drug supply is getting stranger and more diverse and more unprecedented, like week by week. So it's not really a matter anymore of is this heroin versus is this fentanyl? Like we're well past that. We're now into a world of what bizarre concoction do I have in front of me? And the only way to really know that is to look at GCMS. So this is not something that I came up with. Lots of other people have been doing this. And it was Aaron who impressed upon me years ago how much he wanted this, how much drug users wanted this in Texas. And I realized that like from a research standpoint, there was plenty that I could do to help facilitate that and to also kind of understand how it should work for this goal. And so Navdas Gupta at UNC had already had this set up. It's still pretty new. It's growing really quickly. I'm really proud to see how much it's grown, but he very, very kindly agreed to work with us on that to help kind of get it up and running, especially since the Texas Drug User Health Union is very, grassroots. And so we are utilizing his model to get samples from around the state. And so what we started with initially is just looking at heroin. We do have heroin in Texas, not a whole lot. It's down in the South. But we decided at that point, we're going to try to see what's in the heroin supply. Let's kind of start from there. So we have a pretty limited scope that'll be manageable, and then see how it went.
Yeah, we have some of the last samples of heroin in the United States. Tar heroin.
Yeah, it seems to be showing back up in like Portland. I was hearing I can't remember who it was, but someone mentioned that it's periodically showing back up there. Unpredictably unpredictable. It's a good way to think of it. But yeah, we still have some like actual tar heroin down in South Texas. So we were able to look at that, and it was actually really fascinating. We looked at different sites around the states. We found that, way out West Texas in El Paso, which is right on the border and touches Ciudad Juarez, is no heroin, very fentanyl dominant. I talked to the person there and they said, no, that's a turf thing. The people that sell there do not fuck with heroin. They're fentanyl only. It's actually a pretty big reproach if heroin is sold there. So it does not happen. That tends to track over to Dallas. Houston has like an odd little mix. And then, in San Antonio and Austin, which are both on the south end, like Austin, Central Texas, San Antonio is down in the south, we saw a solid amount of heroin. And that seemed to be coming up from Mexico overland. So that was really fascinating. I still get told by people, they're like, there is no more heroin in the US. I'm like, I know what you mean. I do. It's mostly not there. But yeah, we got it there. And we were able to see kind of almost some boundaries, like, this group sells here, this group sells there, this group traffics over I-10, this group traffics over 35, things like that. But then, I also talked to the people that worked on that, and I wanted to get a sense of kind of how it went and what we should change. Because one thing I don't think people necessarily realize is that DEA knows all of this stuff. They test everything. Well, not everything. They test a lot of what they seize, and they know where they get it. So they have a pretty great understanding, but they embargo all of their information. They don't share it with the public. It tends to be explained as we need to keep our cards close to our chest so that we can prosecute effectively and catch people effectively. I was like, there's no reason why we can't kind of replicate this. I'm not super interested in trying to convince DEA to share their data. It sounds like a messy and probably fruitless venture, but we can certainly do the same thing, and we can make sure that our information is for, by, and owned, by people who use drugs. And that's what we've done. And I'll be honest, I've been doing this for about 12 years now, and I've never heard the kind of optimism out of people in interviews that I got from this. Like, people talked about how they wanted to do it for the community. They wanted to do it for their younger self, who didn't know what was in their drugs. They wanted to do it for other people who maybe didn't have a phone, couldn't communicate with us as easily. So, it's really pretty fantastic. And it's pretty fantastic to be able to, as well, to like talk to other researchers who are really unfamiliar with this. And if I tell them, I do work with people who use drugs, and they'll be like, oh yeah, they just don't give a shit, do they? And like, hey, let me tell you about all the incredible pro-social things. Like, if you want to talk about that, some of the things that are really amazing to hear is how embraced this is and how positive it is and how doable it is. Like, people find it incredibly doable. I get asked a lot about is it really difficult for people to figure out? Not at all. And a lot of that I credit Dr. Dasgupta for. He made a very usable interface. But yeah, if you can't tell, I'm really excited about it. We've gotten really good proof of concept, and I'm very eager for this to take off, because understanding what's in your drugs is just an obvious fundamental thing. And I think really anyone that has any stake whatsoever in this issue is going to be interested in it.
Yeah, I really wanted to hear what you see changing over the last couple of years. I know that you co-authored this paper on xylazine in the Harm Reduction Journal, which we can have a link to in the show notes. It's co-authored with Chris Moraff from Narcotica and Aaron Ferguson as well. But that was late 2023, so I wonder if things are changing. I know you were one of the first people to be alerting the public about xylazine, which the general response to that was, okay, let's ban it, right? But then you were one of the sane voices saying that's not going to work. They're just going to replace it with a drug that's sort of similar. And Chris was telling me that he's been seeing more medetomidine, which is a sort of similar drug. Can you tell me like how you see things changing in the drug supply, not just in Texas, but maybe nationally? And also, what do you do when you are doing drug testing and you find something that's super weird that you've never even heard of? Like you have to Google. I know that's happened before. You've told me this story before of, I believe, a patient on a 2,5-I analog or something like that.
Yeah. So yeah, it's what is happening with medetomidine and dexmedetomidine is precisely what we predicted would happen. Yeah, it's, for those of you who don't know, medetomidine is in the same class, like the same drug class as xylazine. It's also a sedative. It acts in a really similar way. Dexmedetomidine, anyway, is the version that's approved for humans. We use that in like a anesthesia cocktail and some other uses. So in that regard, I'm like, well, okay, well, at least there's some human research to go off of. But
unlike xylazine,
right, yeah, xylazine is animals only, and there's essentially nothing out there about what it does in humans. And very thankfully, we got some people that are working on that, including one of NAB's colleagues over at UNC, Zoe McElligott. But, I think that's something that, we really emphasized in the paper was that we don't know the answer. You can't pretend that you have real control over this market. You don't, or this wouldn't have emerged. So what we have to know is what this drug is going to do. Like, what is it doing to people? People are like far and away the thing that grabs attention with xylazine are the wounds appropriately. Still don't know what's going on there. We have good theories. We know what's probably happening. We can't explain the specifics in a way that allows for any kind of actionable prevention outside of just not using it. And so one thing that we emphasized in that paper was like, you can't ban this. Not only will it not work, because when has that ever worked? Not only will that not work, it's going to make it really hard for above ground research to continue. And we need answers sooner, not later. And these drugs are also they're very versatile. Like xylazine is really commonly used for research animals. To anesthetize them for procedures. And if you have to switch your drugs in the middle of a study, sometimes that can invalidate your entire study. It can invalidate all of the data. It depends on what you're doing. And some of these studies are looking at, Alzheimer's, cancer, things like that. So, all of this has a lot of ripple effect. There's a lot going on here we have to consider. And then, xylazine got a lot of attention, and then medetomidine rolled out, just a version of same. And, I imagine we're going to continue to see other similar things just continuing to come out. It just depends on the kind of pressure that's being felt. Kind of like how we're seeing a lot of new opioids, which is probably a result of fentanyl being incredibly hot. And there's not a soul in law enforcement in this planet that's not looking for fentanyl precursors. So the hotter it gets, the more they're going to be pushed to move to something else. So now we're seeing fentanyl analogs and then nitazene opioids. And we're starting to see things that are even a different scaffold from that altogether. And that's just going to continue because there is truly like a bottomless pit when it comes to making new medications. One thing that I try to emphasize to people, I'm like, most of what we have, right, is based from something else because that makes sense. If you're a chemist, if you want to build a new drug, it makes sense to start with something similar, see if you can modify that because that's the most efficient way to do it. And that's what we have been doing, but we don't have to. You can make something new. Organic chemistry is kind of like being really good at using a really cool set of Lego to just build something. And of course, it's harder than that, but I don't think that, sometimes I read these bills that they put out about, like this is my fentanyl nuke bill. There's going to be no more fentanyl after this. And it is like 10 pages, chemical gobbledygook. It's like, it's very obvious that like some poor intern had to go like come up with literally everything that has even been hypothesized to exist. It's just line, 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 line. And they're like, all of this is illegal. And I'm like, this is a big swing. It's still not getting all of it. Like, that's how this works. Like, chemistry is pure creation. So there is, as long as there's motivation to keep going and to keep figuring things out, it's going to keep happening. A long time ago, we didn't even understand what we were doing. We called it alchemy. It was still happening. It's going to continue to happen. We may not be able to even imagine at this point what we're going to be able to do in the future. It doesn't mean it isn't going to happen. So yeah, it's a long way of saying that the concept of like the game of whac-a-mole is very real. It's not going to go anywhere because we're choosing to do battle with an incredibly strong market and motivation, and we're choosing to do battle with pure creation, which is what chemistry really is. And that's a foolish battle we're going to lose.
And there's already all these companies that are poised to profit from this scenario, all these new drugs coming onto the market. That's sort of been the excuse for these high-dose naloxone formulations and some of these other opioid antagonists like nalmefene. Can we talk a little bit about that? And like, are they necessary? Like, do they really help? Like, I mean, I kind of know the answer to this question, but like, what is the motivation here? Is it really like, oh, we're going to actually help people who use drugs, or are we just trying to make a profit here?
Yeah, so this is one of those things that make me especially pessimistic about big pharma, because I spent a lot of time thinking about this and I have a really hard time landing on anything aside from this is a way to make money. Probably not much of a surprise to listeners, but I will explain why I feel that way. So there's obviously a tremendous amount of emotion involved in overdose response. It is always an emotional thing. It's always really distressing, no matter how it goes. And it's also something that has absolutely captured the attention and the anxieties of the public. And that is a very exploitable context, because if you're anxious, if you're emotional, it becomes really easy to bypass facts and logic. And that's a very human thing. But and this has been happening for years. We keep hearing stories about, I had to give this kid 6 doses of naloxone. I had to do 10 doses. Just kept dose, 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 dose. And then they finally woke up. And you hear about stories of naloxone resistant opioids. We've been hearing that for a long time. And these really just get regurgitated and shared without context or without inquiry. And it feels right. It feels correct. Like if you go look at the death rates that we've been seeing over the years, yeah, that fits, that tracks. It feels correct. So, we obviously need stronger, burlier weapons, right? We need nalmefene, we need Cloxato and things like that. But what emerges when you pause, take a breath, and then look at what's happening is that this is largely an anxiety thing. And here's why I say that. So simply from a boring pharmacokinetic standpoint, there is no opioid out there that is naloxone resistant. And it has to do with the way the receptors lay out, with the medications themselves, the drugs themselves, and all of that. We have yet to find an opioid that is untouched by naloxone. And virtually everything that we're seeing out there responds to a dose of 4 milligrams or less. Like Narcan, 1 dose of Narcan takes care of it, often less than that. One thing that Sam Rivera, the director of the overdose prevention sites in New York City, likes to say and emphasize a lot in his speeches is that they usually give less than 1 vial of injectable naloxone when they do overdose response. And a vial of naloxone is 0.4 milligrams. So Narcan at 4 milligrams is actually a really big dose already. And that's considered by a lot of people to be kind of the floor. And we know just from the work of getting this data that Narcan works really well, like at that kind of dose. And it is often more than what anyone needs. So it's a little befuddling to reconcile that and like this pretty straightforward and unambiguous data that we've got with the stories that you hear. So it's like, what's going on? And I'm not a big fan of dismissing anecdotes that don't line up with what I think. I feel like there's a lot of things that we know or have known, I guess, from the science side that end up being kind of weakened or even rebutted by the people on the ground that are actually seeing things change in real time. Again, going back to this, heroin isn't anywhere anymore, Claire. I'm like, no, I know it is. There's things that you hear at the national level that are accepted as fact, and then the people on the ground are actually seeing the changes happen in real time, and they often know way before everyone else does. So I was always being really careful with that. And then what I kind of realized, especially as kind of reading studies that were based on that idea that EMTs and paramedics were having to give multiple doses, was that I realized that there was a huge hole in that argument. And it was that we were not seeing standardization of number of milligrams being given or route being given. There's this paper that loves being, everyone who's like pro nalmefene loves this paper, and it looked at EMS usage of naloxone in the field over time. And, they argue that we need things like nalmefene because that number keeps going up, where it keeps seeing EMTs and paramedics giving more doses over time. But it didn't look at number of milligrams for one, or route of administration. And then what I realized is that, this also echoes bystanders. Bystanders love telling me that they give multiple doses. But the actual instructions are 3 to 5 minutes, right? 2, 3, 5 minutes in between doses. Kind of depends. You should also be giving respirations, just for the record. But one thing I absolutely know from my training is that 3 minutes, if you're standing over someone who isn't breathing, feels like 3 years. Like, it is the longest period of time. It sucks so much to have to sit there and wait for those 3 minutes to tick by. So what we're actually getting is people are basically firing off their naloxone as soon as they could get it loaded up. They would give someone a dose of Narcan, step back for a second, look at them for maybe 5 seconds, whip out another dose, and give that again. By the time 5 minutes actually did roll around, they'd put, 16 milligrams up someone's nose. And we're then telling people, oh, I had to give 2, 3 doses to this person. It's a big difference between I had to and what I did.
Yeah, it's a big contrast to see someone from looking like they're not alive to being totally awake. And I don't know if there are many drugs that do that quickly. The person's just on, you give them this in their nose, and now they're awake, and they're maybe in withdrawal and saying, get the fuck off me. But like, it's crazy because back in the day, right, when naloxone, before it was available to the public, wasn't it just common practice to just give a person a massive bolus and laugh at them while they're vomiting and saying, well, this is what you get when you use drugs, and then trying to have a conversation with them about stopping drug use
while they're in precipitated withdrawal.
Right. And then, I mean, right, how many shows have you seen with like paramedics on there? They're just like, basically talking shit to people who use drugs, or talking shit between themselves about people who use drugs. But then at some point along the line, like, it became public knowledge that, okay, we don't need these massive doses. And then how is that communicated to medical professionals? And they just step down to like, okay, we're going to give them how many milligrams, or maybe we need to give them 10 instead of 1. Or
I think one thing that's important to know is that with a lot of, like, to your question, like, how did we sort that out? A lot of that is like a drug company does something and we follow, which really isn't how it should be. 4 milligrams, like for Narcan, is not magical. I think that 2 milligrams would probably be a better bet. That's what I would like to see, like 2 or 3 in a nasal spray, because there's plenty to be said for the ease of a nasal spray, especially for like more inexperienced bystanders. But 4 is just kind of what the company at the time felt was the most marketable option. And so they ran with it. And so research runs from that because that's what's available. So that's one thing to bear in mind, is that it's not so much that like 4 milligrams is magical. It's just kind of what happened, which is what we're seeing now with Kloxxado. Like, no one asked for that. They landed on 8 because they did. That was just a consumer decision. And they're now kind of manufacturing an idea around it that this is necessary because of XYZ, because we're seeing these stronger opioids, and they're kind of skipping over the fact that even nitazines and the fentanyl analogs, they still respond in the naloxone, still respond to reasonable doses of it. And, nalmefene is even more frustrating because we really didn't ask for that. And especially nalmefene is going to really end up fucking with our ability to induce people onto buprenorphine, which is kind of one of those things that's shown a lot of promise for post overdose. There's a couple of folks around the country that are kind of working on a streamlined passage of, we give you naloxone for an overdose. We go visit you the next day when you're feeling better. We talk to you about buprenorphine. Well, with something like nalmefene, with like a multiple day opioid blockade, we can't do that. So we have to wait longer. And the longer you wait, the harder it is to catch people. So yeah, a lot of this is actively hindering the things that we know work really well in terms of taking care of these people and not, outside of that immediate few minutes of responding to an overdose, because that is really standard. Like that really hasn't changed since naloxone was, proven to work. We've been using that. And like y'all know this, but like in a clinical setting, we usually use naloxone like in a syringe so that we can titrate it pretty carefully. That's the best way to do it. And, unfortunately, kind of tying back to like xylazine and medetomidine, since those are sedatives, they aren't going to respond to naloxone. They aren't opioids, but they do make people less responsive and sleepy. So one thing that has got to be happening is like someone looks like they're having an overdose, and maybe they are, like maybe they took a combo of fentanyl and xylazine, and someone gives them naloxone and they start breathing again because it got rid of the fentanyl, or, it removed the fentanyl, but they aren't waking up. They aren't sitting up, speaking clearly, making eye contact, and these things that we used to see when it was just fentanyl. And so they're interpreting that as they're still in overdose. I need to give them more and more and more. So this is one of those things, like I don't have like the evidence to prove that. It's not the kind of research that I do, but it makes perfect sense that that's what we're going to see. So another thing I've been trying to emphasize to people is that the goal with naloxone is breathing. This person does not need to be wide awake and, discussing Real Housewives with you. They need to be breathing well on their own. That's the goal. And if you're just going to keep giving naloxone to them until they wake up, you may not ever get there.
Can you imagine a world in which people would not want to be rescued from an overdose?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, but they will feel like crap afterwards. The other thing that I've heard about nalmefene is like you can go into withdrawals for like 24 hours, or it works for like 24 hours and the withdrawals are really bad. And so you'll want to use again, and then you're just wasting drugs. And I mean, I hear that all the time, unfortunately.
Yeah. Unfortunately. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think we all do. Like it's something that you taught me, Aaron, was like some of the older like folk remedies were like just do a hot shot of meth to bring me back.
Yeah, I've been revived that way before. You just put the meth in a syringe, shake it up with you draw some blood, and then just mix it with the blood and put it back. So there's no water involved. And it's a lot more potent that way to inject any drug that's water soluble. I've been revived that way before. And that, this is before naloxone was available. Hey, healthcare.
Yeah. But I think too, the fact that like with these drugs, the one big thing that's missing is consideration for the population it's going to be used on. And so, some people are interested in it and they want to learn more about it. And I don't begrudge them that. I do think that people really have to understand like what this is going to be doing. It also matters in the sense that most of us throughout the country, we get naloxone or whatever antagonist through like state level purchasing agreements usually. So if your state decides that they're going to switch to nalmefene, then everyone in your state is going to be getting that, and it limits your ability to have some autonomy and choice in that. And unfortunately, I think that's what these drug companies are betting on. They don't make money by selling directly to harm reduction orgs. Like, no, there's no money there. There's money in public health agencies. There's money in state health agencies. And those people very traditionally don't listen to drug users. I don't think there's many of us in this country that have a really great relationship with our state health agencies, where we feel really listened to and valued. Like that's a rare situation. But if you are an elected person or an appointed person at the state level, you can easily make an argument to the public that you just bought, the strongest weapon against overdose, and you're taking it very seriously. And so you got this really high dose product. And that's going to look great in the press release. It's going to make you look like you are tackling this super hard. And unfortunately, it's not that simple. So yeah, I'm afraid of all of this happening, and we're going to have to do what we can. But the more I can get people to kind of stop and consider that a sledgehammer isn't necessary, that, you're very empowered to save the people in front of you with, an injectable vial or even Narcan at a, relatively mundane 4 milligram dose, then, the better.
Yeah. One of the greatest pieces that I read from you, at least in my view, and there's only a few pieces of journalism out there on the topic that you can find, was the pernicious myth of the fentanyl-laced marijuana. And there's a thread of us that has been going on. It's, folks who are just either outright disillusioned, amused, or infuriated by the mythology around fentanyl and marijuana. That's a fascinating myth to me because of the way that it's evolved over the years, and it's come and gone, and it seems to be persisting for quite some time, despite overwhelming countervailing evidence.
I don't know. I understand. I do. It sucks to have to try to get people to think about chemistry. That's one thing that kind of plagues all of drugs, is that a lot of times the easiest way to understand it is to think a little bit about chemistry and a little bit about physics. And for a lot of people, that is an actively triggering word. It makes them think of like the worst class they had in school. So I get it. Another thing that is making all of this worse, and I again empathize with people, is the fact that if you go test bud that's been rolling around in like someone's like prep area, it probably will have a little bit of fentanyl on it. That's not very surprising because bud is tacky. Like, it is sticky. Like, that's its nickname, right? Like, it literally has stickiness to the touch. It picks up a lot. It's actually pretty gross if you look at it under a microscope. It picks up dust and hair and skin. But so yeah, if it's being handled by someone in a space that had previously handled fent or handled coke, it probably has picked up a little bit of trace. And the kind of tests that the cops do in the field are just not good tests. Like, they're so shitty that they aren't admissible in court in most states, because science is just not great. It's easy to get false positives and negatives. And it's very much a yes-no thing. Like, it doesn't have any kind of discretion. So sometimes I see these stories and they're like, Claire, you've got to be wrong. Look at this. They got this bud and they did that field test and it said it was positive for fent. I'm like, I actually believe that. I do. And it's just why I explained. The difference is that there could be the tiniest little trace on there and it would still hit positive. But even more than that, it has to do with how we use that weed. Like, I tell people, I'm like, I hold up a finger and I pause when it comes to really processed versions of cannabis, because the more you process anything, the more room there is for contamination. So if you are buying weird bootleg carts, yeah, I definitely advise you to be careful because there's a lot more going on. But with bud, like unprocessed bud, which is what most people are using, at least at this point in states where it's not legal, the environment is changing rapidly in states with legalization. But, if you light it on fire, you're destroying that fentanyl immediately. If you're vaping it, like in a PAX or a G pen or something, it's not getting hot enough to vaporize the fentanyl, even if it's in there. And like, if those pens got hot enough to vaporize fentanyl, because there's a separation of about 150 degrees, it would run down the battery quickly. It would make it riskier to handle, all of that. And then if it's an edible, like, we already lose some fentanyl when we swallow it, which is why, like, we don't give people fentanyl pills. Like any fentanyl that's oral has to go in through the side of your cheek. And of course, people overdose from pills. That absolutely happens. It would be ridiculous to claim otherwise. The dose has to be really big in those. And that has been the case. It has. But again, like if you're looking at trace amounts of fents on your bud that you are breaking down and making an edible from, not only is your liver going to knock out a lot of it if you eat it, fentanyl is also not great in heat. It breaks down when it gets hot, it breaks down in the sun. So, in the process of like heating, baking your edible, you're going to ruin a lot of it. So, and in that article you're talking about, Aaron, like I break all of this down, right? So I'm like, all of that is true. I will still absolutely hold space for the fact that people do wacky ass shit when it comes to their drugs. Like, is it possible that someone will? Yes. Like the thing with the vapes, they're like, is it possible that a teenager would like put in an extra hot coil? Of course it's possible. People do weird shit all the time.
Has boofing blood became a thing yet?
Like, yes, no, exactly. So I'm like, but even if you set that aside and look at what actually has happened, so many people use cannabis. Like, I don't think that people outside of our field realize how many people use cannabis in the US. It is staggering. If like 1% of Americans had a fentanyl overdose from their weed, like if that was a thing, and even 1% of the people in the country that use cannabis had a fentanyl overdose from contaminated cannabis, there would be, I think, 250,000 deaths every year just from that. Just from that. And I'm like, that's not a thing. We would have, actual verified, lab verified, cases of this happening. There would be way too many for that to have just slipped under the radar. So, I mean, I get it, man. I do. And there's so much unknown with these markets. And if at the end of the day, you want to avoid all of it, I get it. But I do hope that people kind of understand how deeply improbable it is for weed to be the source of your fent. Even if it's testing positive, just the way that we use like unprocessed bud just does not gel well with fentanyl. Yeah, no, this one will not die. And, I keep telling people, I'm like, here are the facts. If you don't love the facts, if they aren't feeling convincing to you, that's okay. You can keep thinking about it. But if you're still really anxious about it, this is kind of the ultimate argument for federal legalization and standardization of the cannabis market. I'm like, if all of this was above ground and, everyone had eyes on this issue would go away. It's the exact same reason why we don't accidentally get fentanyl and Advil. Like, this is really well regulated stuff, and that's the actual answer. Like, I was just in Vegas recently, and I got to go to one of the legal dispensaries there, and I was blown away. Like, they had big, open, visible labs where you could watch them making extracts and concentrates and things, like squeaky clean, brightly lit spaces, and everything was quantified, everything was packaged. And like, is there a lot of private equity money in this that makes it all a lot more interesting? And there's plenty to discuss there. Yes. But it's like, we can do this. No one has to sit here and worry about what mystery products are on, their cannabis products in this kind of context.
Yeah, I mean, I hear stories all the time of legal cannabis being recalled for mold or heavy metal contamination or whatever,
Yep.
but you actually hear about these recalls like
Right.
on dark markets or underground markets. Like, you don't hear about those really.
Yeah.
There's not really, unless you have a really good supplier that's really generous and cares about things, like they're not going to throw away something that's contaminated.
Right. Yeah. And the thing with heavy metals too, that's also kind of a residue of an unregulated market as well, because if you have no regulation and you're having to do everything that you can to maximize your product because you're going to lose so much from, police seizures and things, then you're going to plant your product in iffy land. And that is where those plants pick up things like cadmium. So yeah, all of it. I'm like, if you are made anxious by this, my heart goes out to you. Go fight for legalization and regulation. That's the answer.
Yeah. That's why I tell people to avoid or be careful about hemp products because they can be,
Hmm.
they can be a THC or a THC analog, but it's not a well-regulated market. So like there is a lot of, it's sort of like agricultural chemistry. So some of these processes aren't as
Yeah.
well controlled,
I
to
mean,
put it
it's
lightly.
very much at this point like the supplements market, but even worse.
Hmm.
Um, like some of the things that show up in supplements are pretty spooky, even in ones in like major names. And I don't
Yeah.
think people realize that if something isn't like an FDA overseen prescribed pharmaceutical, that it's very much the Wild West. So,
Yeah. The FDA doesn't regulate supplements at all, but
no,
like you don't usually put them in your lungs.
this is true. Yeah.
So
Like people do weird things with their body, but it seems like a lot of that took off right around the Clinton administration. I think it was their administration that created like tons of funding for what's called alternative medicine, and even
Hmm.
doctors were incentivized to promote a lot of these as supplementary practices to whatever it was that they were prescribing.
Yeah.
So it gains some sort of faux legitimacy when you see it on the shelf of your local pharmacy right next to Advil or ibuprofen or Tylenol.
Yeah. Yeah. That is a whole other mess.
But I've always thought that like the harm reduction community needs kind of like a Neil deGrasse Tyson type who can just kind of explain science to everyone. Um,
Man, people like that are powerful.
yeah,
What's that say?
exactly. I think Bill Nye, the science guy, now has a new show that's actually for adults, though.
I love that. I've been saying for a while, I'm like, my like dream class to teach in the future would be this is like chemistry for babies, but we're going to use drugs to talk about it. Because, like, I don't know if either of y'all have been through like college chemistry. They are tremendously consistent across the country, and that has to do with how we usually test students, and I won't even get into it. But the actual examples that you use to learn things tend to be very consistent. Like, I'm willing to bet that like 60% of the country that has taken college level organic chemistry made aspirin in one of their labs. Like, it is that consistent. And that was probably the most interesting lab that I had. They tend to be really boring. We make really boring things. And it's really hard for people to get interested in it. And it breaks my heart because I'm like, y'all are making new things. Like, you're making this stuff like from scratch. Like, it's actually badass as hell. Like, this is really, really cool. And you find it awful. And I get why, because this is so dull. But I'm like, if instead of teaching you how to distill and extract something using like whatever awful example we've got, like, let me tell you that how we process cocaine uses these techniques that when they have to get the compound out of the plant and then process it in from like coca into cocaine, we use these three techniques. Their eyes light up and they're like, oh my God, really? I'm like, yes, it's basic baby chemistry and that's what we're going to learn today. I'm like, that's what we should be doing. And that would be so fun. And that would be also great for like adult learners. But like a lot of this, I feel like we're able to keep just bullshit mythology around all of this. Like the fentanyl touch overdoses is another good example. Like they do not die, even among adults that really should know better. And I think a lot of it has to do with the idea that, like, if it's a drug, quote unquote, all bets are off. Like it exists in its own space somewhere. I'm like, literally everything on our planet is bound by the same rules. And we can explain why it does or doesn't work. But people have this like very deep, visceral reaction to having to think about science because we do a shit job of teaching it. And the fact that that's where drugs live, I think it makes it so easy for people to get really entrenched in like this bizarre urban legend that should in no way continue, but it does. And it has these very real effects. Like people love sending me things. They're like, hey, Claire, I saw this in my grocery store and it's fentanyl resistant nitrile gloves, which were already fentanyl resistant. And, it's the DEA insisting until the cows come home that that is a real thing that we have to worry about. And it's, absolutely bonkers. I'm like, if this was actually true, every anesthesiologist in the entire world would be very long dead. We handle this stuff all the time and it's just not a deal. But, if you try to, it's a delicate line to walk. You've got to like figure out what really matters and then try to make it really consumable. But I'm glad that like those articles helped with that. I was like, I don't know. I feel like if I actually understand this, I should be able to explain it to someone that doesn't find this interesting and still get them to like walk away with some appreciation for what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Well, I know we're getting low on time here, but I have one more question that I just will kick myself if I don't ask on the show. And it's about an emerging thing. It's people have been going back and forth about it, and I've heard a lot of different points made on it. We don't have to talk a lot about it, but I just wanted to hear what you thought about it on the show, which is this new vaccine for opioids. That you could vaccinate someone against. And I've heard it presented in a lot of different ways. Like, this is a lifesaver. This is absolute shit. Like, what do you think?
So there's kind of a lot going on with the opioid vaccine because there's a couple of different approaches that have been tried. Bottom line is, I see vaccination as a issue in terms of consent. And that gets really hairy because that's what anti-vaxxers say too, right? And it's not like that. It's because an opioid vaccine is not vaccinating against a pathogen. It's vaccinating against something that people choose to consume. So this is a very new kind of ethical paradigm. So I have a lot of reservations about it. My bottom line take on this is that it's not good. And the reason for that is because I really struggle to see a future where we have an opioid vaccine where it's not used coercively. Like we already see that with existing things like naltrexone. And I'm not even a naltrexone hater. Like, I don't think it has great evidence, but if you love it, if it helps you, I want you to have it. But we definitely do that. Like, we tell people like, hey, you can only get out on parole if you agree to take this medication. Like, hey, you're going to lose privileges in jail if you don't take this medication. Like, that's coercion. That's not consent. And that's not okay. And at least with something like naltrexone, like, it's got a clock on it. It's going to run out. The point of a vaccine is that you don't have to keep giving it and giving it and giving it. It's long acting. So I feel like that could be used with even a greater degree of coercion. I have a hard time seeing a world in which that doesn't happen. I think if we lived in some kind of great, perfect utopia, then there would be more of an option to let people choose to take that if they think it works. But I don't think that's what's going to happen. Also, so far, the opioid vaccines that have been developed don't last very long. And there's been a lot of effort to try to get around that. And that effort is very expensive. So we're spending, like, doing vaccine research properly is expensive because you have to do research on animals, and doing that ethically is expensive. And a lot of money is being kind of sunk into that when at best it might be used ethically by a handful of people. I'm like, this isn't a good return. I see this being used mostly punitively to make people's lives worse. And then depending on like how the vaccine is developed, it could either be like something hyper specific, like this is only going to vaccinate against fentanyl, for example, or it could be quite general. It depends on how they engineer the components of the vaccine. So theoretically, they could get to a point where you're vaccinated against opioids, which would then be horrible problem if you needed pain control down the line. Like, I think a lot of people, like, this gets back into like my deep hatred of all or nothing thinking. I'm like, all or nothing thinking is virtually always incorrect. If it's something that humans touch, we are all about nuance. And it's really easy to look at what's happening right now as a young, healthy person who is not in pain and say, yeah, fuck this, vaccinate everyone against fentanyl, make it go away. And then you break a bone, you need surgery, you need an epidural during labor, and your opioids don't work. You don't want to experience that. Like, no one wants a post-opioid world. You don't want a post-opioid existence. You know, opioids are not bad. Fentanyl isn't bad. Fentanyl is a really good medication. You have to use it correctly. You have to use it in the right setting. You have to know that you're using it. And those are the things that are, killing people. So it's this like all or nothing thinking is never good thinking. The opioid vaccine, because they at one point they were also looking at a cocaine vaccine, like that was also in trial for a while, and that didn't pan out. There's major logistical issues with that. I don't know that we're going to see a successful drug vaccine anytime soon. The biggest reason is that, like, if you choose to use a drug, you're taking in millions, billions, maybe more of the molecule. Whereas if someone sneezes on you and flu flies up your nose, you're getting a relatively small dose of little virions, like the virus. So your body can knock those out. If you're snorting a bump, that is way more molecules of cocaine than your body can tackle at that point. So the paradigm that we've got so far, like immunologically, when we're building out vaccines, does not really gel with that, which I think is the major reason why all of which is to say, I don't like them. I'm really concerned about how they would be used, and we're spending too much money on them.
Yeah.
Because vaccine research is expensive.
Yeah, it seems really counterproductive. I interviewed Dr. Nora Valkoff at NIDA about pre-addiction. She was kind of, other people were pushing this concept, and I think they kind of abandoned it because it doesn't make any sense. But I asked her, like, how's the opioid vaccine going? And she said something about how they were exploring use of monoclonal antibodies as a way of doing it, which is sort of a therapy that they've used to treat COVID. That was 2 years ago almost. So, I mean, I don't know where they are at the research stage at this point, but I think I agree with you. It comes from a point of a foregone conclusion about how drug use even works and addiction even works. They want it to be like this mathematical equation.
Yeah.
Like drugs plus person equals addiction. And that just ignores so much about like what drives addiction, which is often trauma, or especially childhood sexual abuse and that kind of thing. So it's like the whole healthcare system is way too focused on individuals and blaming individuals. And if you're depressed or you have anxiety, it's your fault and you need to fix it, instead of looking at these bigger systemic issues in society. I could keep going on, but I think we all get the point. Like, a vaccine is not going to make it so that you are, it's just like such a simplistic way of approaching it that it just drives me nuts when we have low cost solutions like what Canada has been doing with Safe Supply. I know those programs are under attack, but
yeah,
the point is it's vastly cheaper to give someone Dilaudid than to try to develop a completely new paradigm of vaccine for drug use. It's just absurd.
100%. Yeah. That's like, I get, like, living in Texas, we get a lot of really incredulous people all the time. And what people ask me a lot is like, so you're anti-prevention. And I'll take that as a moment to explain to them, I'm like, I'm actually very pro prevention. I think pretty much everyone is. Like, I don't think I've ever met anyone who is like, no, we should have a world where people are suffering. Of course not. It just doesn't look how you think it looks. I'm like, DARE was garbage. One pill kills is bad messaging. But actual prevention would look like support for kids and parenting, good education, good healthcare. It would look like really good, easy to access, comprehensive medical care and mental health care. Like, it would look like all of these things. Like, we would eventually get to a world where, like, quote unquote problematic drug use is pretty uncommon, because you would have anything that you would possibly want to address your traumas and your pain. And then, that would create space to kind of parse out the different ways people use drugs. Like, I want to use this for fun. I want to use this for sex. I want to use this to explore like the bounds of my own mind, which are all different flavors of drug use than what most people imagine. Like, if they're imagining a homeless person overdosing on fentanyl on the street, like, that's a different setup. But it all gets smushed together under this big monolith of, this has to be snuffed out. This is uniformly bad.
That's why most people's definitions of prevention differ so broadly. I know a lot of people actually, when they say the word prevention, they're actually referring to preventing drug use. And usually when it pertains to adolescents or training in schools. It's the abstinence-based training. And so people are speaking completely different languages when they say prevention. And what is it that we're trying to prevent? There is some ethical morass around the very idea of giving people a drug without their consent. Reductio ad absurdum, you could say, if we had a pill to force people to take that would prevent psychopathy, prevent them from becoming a person like Jeffrey Dahmer, for instance, would it be ethical to make everyone take it? It has no other effect but to prevent you from becoming a serial killer.
Ooh.
Would it be ethical to make everyone take that pill? And then people start, it's one of these trolley problems. Most people that I pose that to will respond with no. It's just like it's intuitive. There's something intuitive about saying you're going to force everyone to take this drug, regardless of what it does. It's a much different conversation with what we're talking about. But there's some ethical layers to it. And there's moral dumbfounding, I think. People's moral intuitions dumbfound sometimes reason. Anyway, this has been a lot of fun. I know we're getting to time here. I think we could talk for hours and hours, honestly. And Claire and I have just learned so much. Hope folks that are listening in have learned a thing or two. We've been enjoying bringing you these episodes, and we're going to continue to do so. Claire is just an amazing advocate for science and reason when it comes to people who use drugs. She's a very compassionate person, and I've been honored to work with her locally. We're just lucky to have her on the show today. Thanks to all the folks who continue to support us in our continuing efforts to challenge stigma against our people who use drugs. Thank you for everything that you do. And thank you so much, Claire, for being part of this discussion today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, both of y'all, for having me on and for the kind words. I'm very honored.
One more thing I really definitely want to highlight for listeners is, Claire, you have an amazing Etsy store and you make amazing art. Like, if you wanted to talk about that a little bit, like I've just
thank you.
It fills me with joy. It's great. So
thank you.
Where can people find that?
Yeah. So it's if I knew it was going to take off, I wouldn't have named it this. It's called Pen Merger. It's PINPEN merger.etsy.com. That is a linguistics thing. So I have a pen merger, and it's a feature of Southern and Texas accents. But yeah, I try to, some of it I just do for fun. Some of it I do very intentionally, like with collaboration with other harm reductionists. Like I recently released some keychains that have the steps for responding to an overdose on them. That came from West Virginia harm reduction. And the folks there had just made one of those with like a Sharpie. And they mentioned like, man, I've done this how many times, but if I see someone blue in front of me, my brain just goes blank. I'm like, yeah, that happens to people all the time. Actually, that's really normal. We can put like a really simple list on the back here. Like, this is what you do. This is how often you give a breath. So sometimes it's really cool, actionable collaborations. And by the way, the West Virginia harm reduction folks get a portion of the sales from that. But some of it I just do for fun because I don't know, I get politically frustrated in Texas a lot, and it's either sit down and draw something or, I don't know, let my blood pressure go up. So it can be a good outlet.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'm in the possession of the first ever methadone plushie.
Yeah. You got the sample.
Plushies, yeah. And I just love it. And so if folks haven't seen Claire's shop, and many of you probably have, definitely support it if you can. It's an amazing cause. We need this type of thing out in the community.
Thank you. And yeah, so I spend a lot of my shop money on harm reduction here in Texas because we can't use state money for things like strips or syringes. We got to figure that out on our own. So
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show.
Of course.
Thanks for listening to Narcotica, an independent production by Narco Media. Co-hosted and co-produced by Troy Farah, Christopher Moraff, and me, Aaron Ferguson. If you like the show, you can find out more at narcocast.com and support us by joining our Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/narcotica. Patreons get free stickers, which are personally mailed to them and can request a shout out on the show. And now patrons can even get 30% off of merch in our new store, which is at narcocast.myshopify.com. We have t-shirts and coffee mugs, one that says there are drugs in here, which is awesome. More stuff will be added soon. As always, we're so grateful to the folks that make this show possible. I mean, really, a little goes a long way, so thanks for making Narcotica keep going. We're ad-free. We want to keep it that way if we can. If Patreon isn't for you, that's fine. You can help us out just by spreading the word. Tell all your friends about the podcast, advocate for social justice, and abolish the drug war. You can also rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and that helps the show get a boost. Our theme music is by Glass Boy, and Jenny Shea is the voice of Narcotica. Additional music's by myself, Nomad1. And you can follow us on Spotify, iTunes, Twitter, YouTube, Baseball, Instagram, SoundCloud, YouTube, all good outlets. Those are the best ways to try to contact us as well if you have a suggestion, complaint, or if you just want to tell us nice things. That's everything, folks. Hope you have a great week and stay safe out there in the drug world.